Bad. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to our journey, our discovery journey, how Islamic civilization and sciences impacted the West. This is part 3. And this part is going to focus on the decline of Islamic civilization and sciences and the rise of European Renaissance. And if we have time, I will examine examples of European scientific output during 16th and 17th century. In particular, I will do one example on astronomy and one on medicine, just to demonstrate how at that time, the scientific output of Renaissance was actually based on Islamic science. Okay, so we start with the decline of Islamic civilization and sciences. My voice is okay, right? Is my voice okay? You can all hear me.
We can, yes, it's a little bit heavy. I'm not sure if you're using a different equipment today, but it's all right. We can understand what you're saying.
Okay, alhamdulillah. Maybe it's too close.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. There was a decline. Okay, there was a decline, and this is a fact. We cannot deny it. And what is the evidence? The evidence is we don't have any more today. Nor did we have in the last 200 years these creative geniuses, these polymaths like Al-Razi, Al-Khawarizmi, Ibn al-Haytham, Ibn Sina, Al-Biruni, all these big names who build the Islamic civilization in terms of sciences. We don't have those. Neither did we have, I said, the last 200 years. The last of such Muslim thinkers to produce significant and original scientific works and innovations had lived and died in the 17th and 18th century. That was the last time. So there was a decline. So at some point in time, there was actually the decline, and our task in this talk is to address this area. We want to locate when did it decline, and hopefully we can figure out why did it decline. Because these are two questions that bothers Muslims when we read about our beautiful heritage. So people, they're asking, why did we lose it? Why don't we have today? Why can't we have something like that, So this is what we're trying to address. Now, Orientalists, they will prefer to place the decline in the 12th century. And they will attribute the decline to the fall of Toledo in 1085 and Sicily in 1091. But we say it's true that the fall of Toledo and Sicily gave Europe access to massive Muslim scientific knowledge and culture, but it will take another 500 years before Europeans gain confidence and were able to pull themselves out of the dark age. So it is not fair to say the Islamic science declined in the 12th century. Now, Western intellectuals, they would prefer to place the decline of Islamic civilization and sciences as early as possible, mainly for two reasons. Number one, they want to disconnect this modern science from Islamic sciences in order to claim that this modern science is purely a European enterprise. And we see this consistently, and this is a subject I address in the first part, the attitude of Europeans toward the legacy of Islamic civilization and sciences. Now, also, they want to dissociate the decline from the European colonization of Muslim lands because they want to escape responsibility for the destruction of systems in the Muslim lands, the educational system, the legal system, the political system. So they don't want to take any responsibility of that, and that's why they are pushing it much, much earlier. Now, There are intellectuals, Western intellectuals, who agree, all right, to place the decline in the 12th century, but they give a different reason. Okay, and this is what is taught in many of the institutions, academic institutions in the West. They put the blame on Imam al-Ghazali, who was a giant of Muslim scholars of the classical period, but they say he is the root cause of the decline. Now, I want you to watch this short video. It's about 6 minutes, but you know, it's very important because it does represent the Western thinking. There's a lot of nonsense in it, and we'll try to unpack that.
September 11th, 2001, we just had our 10th anniversary of that. I happen to live 3.5 blocks from what became known as Ground Zero. This image was taken outside my dining room window. The North Tower is on fire. These are 110-story buildings, the World Trade Center towers. This image is the instant the South Tower was hit. It was hit from the left. You cannot see the entry point because we're blocked by this other black building. It's a hotel, a 50-story hotel, which is just kind of in the foreground. You see part of the South Tower punching out. This is before the jet fuel had ignited. And when you ignite jet fuel, you set a deflagration wave, not a bomb wave. It's a different kind of wave. It's not accompanied by a shock. This is a split second after that, the fuel has ignited, creating more pressure, and within a split second of that, the entire South Tower was engulfed. And this is fragments of plane and bodies and office coming out the other side. Now, why am I dragging you through this? Okay, 62 minutes later, both buildings had collapsed. And there was blue sky where there was once these buildings. This is directly outside of my apartment building, and the emergency vehicles had come. This is the pulverized World Trade Center dust that had settled several inches of it. I say this because shortly after this gentleman got up, President of the United States, George W. Bush. This is actually my photo of him. I was in that room at that time when he spoke. See the medals there on the table? I was on a committee to tell him who to give those medals to, the Presidential Medal of Science. And so he actually gave them to everyone we told him to give them to, except he didn't read their citations. He's smart enough to know not to pronounce any of the science words that were in the citation. So he put the medal around the neck, somebody else read the citations. Shortly after September 11th, he gets up, I don't remember where he gave the speech, and he says, in an attempt to distinguish we from they, he says, our God is the God who named the stars. This is before I was on his Rolodex. You know, I could have saved him from himself, okay? It's a loose quote from Genesis that says God named all the stars in the sky, okay? First of all, it's the same God, so he's got that wrong. But Allah, God of Islam and God of the Jewish God, it's the same God. They call them different names, but it's the same book delivering you the same God. Apart from him getting that wrong, he says, our God is the God who named the stars. What he just didn't know, 2/3 of all stars in the night sky have Arabic names. 2/3 of all stars that have names, these are all the Arabic star names, all of these. I don't think this is the point he wanted to make. I just think he figured that out. Like I said, it was before I was on his Rolodex. And so you say, well, how does this happen? How do you get a culture where stars in the night sky are named by them? What was going on? How did that happen? And you have to go back 1,000 years, and you get to Islam in what's the golden period of Islam. In that period, algebra was invented. Algorithm is an Arabic word. All these words that begin with AL, 10 to 1, it's an Arabic word. Our numerals are Arabic numerals. Did you pause and reflect on why we call them Arabic numerals? them that, right? But somebody did good stuff with these numerals. It was in Baghdad 1,000 years ago where they invented algebra. And there was advances in mathematics, agriculture, engineering, math, all of these fields. All at a time when Europe was disemboweling heretics. So something changed. 12th century, this gentleman came around, Al-Ghazali, a Muslim scholar, learned. At this point, Islam is maybe just a few hundred years old. People are reading the Quran and interpreting it however they sort of want to and feel like it. There's not a coherence to the practice of Islam until he comes around and codifies the behavior of a good Muslim. In much the same way St. Augustine, in his book, Cities of God, codified what it is to be a good Christian. How do you burn the witches? There's a recipe for that. They got to be upside down so the blood does, There's a whole itinerary for how to be a good Muslim. And in his writings contain the assertion that the manipulation of numbers is the work of the devil. 2, actions that you see in nature are the will of Allah. Well, if you drop a stone and it falls, Allah willed that. If that's your explanation, your curiosity stops. You combine everything happening in nature being the will of Allah to the manipulation of numbers being the work of the devil, and the entire enterprise of that golden era collapses. Now, historians, when they look at that era, they say, well, the Mongols came and they, so historians think of the world in terms of wars and kings. They think less about it philosophically, about intellectual movements or the absence thereof. Islam rose again after this period, didn't have science associated with it. No new inventions in math. You look at the period of Islam in Spain, the period where the great Alhambra was built. There is no attendant science going on there. It's done, it's gone, and it is a cost that exists to this day. There's 1.3 billion Muslims in the world today who are not participants on the frontier of scientific discovery.
Wow, there's a lot of nonsense from an educated person. The speaker is Neil deGrasse Tyson, and he's a renowned American astrophysicist, very popular person. His Facebook page, I think, has got about 4 million followers. I pulled this video from his Facebook, and you can imagine. His view on Islam and the legacy of Islamic civilization and sciences is typical Western. It's marred with distortions. So what I want to do is to defend the position of Al-Ghazali. But first of all, I have to address some of these nonsense that he was talking about. First of all, if I ignore the fact that he's a new atheist, and therefore he has this instinct that petitioned him to connect Islam to violence, and that's why he took a long time to explain about the September 11 and connect that to Muslims. But I'm not going to address that part. Now, he got it all wrong when he said that at the time of Al-Ghazali, Islam was only a few hundred years old. People interpreted the Quran as they like. There was no coherent way to practice Islam. And it was Al-Ghazali who codified what is Muslims could conduct. This is all nonsense, because at the time of Al-Ghazali, Islam was 500 years old, and the full hadith corpus existed with detailed isnad. All the schools of jurisprudence, madahib, were established. Major Quran tafsirs were available. Example, Al-Tabari died in the 10th century, so it was already there. And all methodologies of the Islamic sciences were established. The usul al-fiqh, usul al-hadith, usul al-Quran. Okay, so this nonsense that is giving, if he was commenting this on other areas, I think he would be, he will be called on contempt, but you can bash Islam and nothing will happen to you. Now, even this what he said about Imam Ghazali in his writing, he says manipulation of numbers is the work of devil. There is no place in the Ghazali's writing where you can find that statement, and I have checked. Also, his asceticism on God's will over the universe contradicts his own worldview. As an atheist, the physical universe is just a byproduct of a purposeless, mindless, random nature. Yet it did not stop his curiosity to study cosmology. So why should it kill curiosity of Muslims and not of atheists? What is the philosophical basis or grounding of this view? Of course, God rules over the universe, but we may and should inquire into the natural world without harming religion. This is what the Quran teaches, and this is what the medieval Muslims taught Europeans at the time when Christianity was incarcerating scientists. I think we need to respond to this, this kind of accusation. So let's look at Ghazali. Most of those who put the blame of the decline of Islamic civilization and sciences on Imam Ghazali, they usually argue because Al-Ghazali, he wrote this Tahafut al-Falasifa, the incoherence of the philosopher. He was kind of attacking the philosopher, and this is what kills science. All right, this is their claim. But what they do not understand is, during the classical period, the field of philosophy, it combined metaphysics and natural sciences together. And it was Muslims who later split it into separate field because of the establishment of empirical sciences. So Al-Ghazali attacked only the use of metaphysics, the metaphysical aspect of the Greek philosophy that appear to be contradictory to Islamic theology, Aqidah. He tried to define or demarcate the religious boundaries and will criticize those teachings, in his opinion, overstep them. But he never attacked sciences or mathematics. That is totally not true, it's a lie. Now, Al-Ghazali, who was himself schooled in philosophy, did not see tension between religion, philosophy, and sciences. He even went further in some of his writing in considering that it is obligatory for Muslims to master all of these sciences, to master philosophy, to master religion, of course, and to master sciences. So Al-Ghazali, what he did, he made a critical study of theological views, Aqidah, of those Muslim philosophers, and he laid down a general framework for dealing with Greek metaphysics in Islamic theology. So in his refutation, he wrote this Tahafut al-Falasifa, in which he objected about 20 different views of the philosophers, and 3 of them, he considered them as being very serious. For example, resurrection and life in the final abode will be spiritual rather than bodily. He didn't accept that because it contradicts the Quran. Also, the idea that God knows only the universal but not the particulars because he has given human being a free will. Also, this is contradiction to what is in the Quran. And the last point is that the universe is eternal. There was this idea, people, they thought the universe was eternal, and this also contradicts the Quran because the Quran is very clear that Allah created and sustained the universe. So his argument is very valid argument, Al-Ghazali. He did not attack science. He attacked Aqidah that was contradictory to the teaching of the Quran and Sunnah. Now, Imam Al-Ghazali, whom the West misrepresent as irrational, as we have seen with this guy, is the one actually who taught the West the principles of rational inquiry. Because shukuk, or intellectual skepticism, which we have covered this in the first and in the second part, is the foundation of modern science. And Al-Ghazali was the champion of shukuk, as he will always start his research on any topic with an attitude of intellectual skepticism. René Descartes, the French philosopher, and among the first one to start, the idea of rationalism in the West, he long after followed Al-Ghazali method of shukuk, and he was influenced by Al-Ghazali in this methodology in their pursuit of knowledge. So most of this stuff is nonsense. Now, other Western intellectuals, they locate the decline of the Islamic civilization and sciences a century later, after the fall of Toledo in Sicily and after Ghazali, and they attribute this to the Mongolian destruction of Baghdad in 1258. Now, there are many historical accounts of the Mongolian siege and devastation of Baghdad. The literature sources are filled with stories on how horrendous, how barbaric it was. So how could anyone expect to sustain civilization and progress after that? Now, it is true that the Mongolian siege did take place in 1258 under Hulagu Khan, and it was quite devastating. Okay, the Mongol army, the Mongol army ransacked Baghdad, committed numerous atrocities, including the massacre of the Khalifa and residents, and destruction of the famous House of Wisdom, or Beit al-Hikmah, and many other public libraries. There are many stories of that. But during the peak of Abbasid dynasty, centralized authority of Baghdad had already decentralized to many independent centers of power. So learning and research institutions sprang up across the Muslim world to rival each other. The Muslim civilization at that time did not depend only on Baghdad. Therefore, the Mongolian siege of Baghdad did not cause a decline. And in fact, the Mongols themselves, soon as they embraced Islam, and they became instruments of expansion. So if the fall of Toledo and Sicily or Al-Ghazali, were responsible for the decline of Islamic civilization and sciences in the 12th century, then how do we explain this great scientific output of great scholars like Al-Jazari, Ibn Baytari, Mu'ayyiddin al-Urdi, Nasruddin al-Tusi, Ibn Nafis, Qutbuddin al-Shirazi, Kamaluddin al-Farisi, Nizamuddin al-Zaburi, Ibn Shatir. All of these, they have produced very important work, and they all lived, worked, and died after the fall of Toledo and Sicily and after Al-Ghazali. How do you explain that? And if the Mongolian invasion of Baghdad was responsible for the decline, then how do we explain the presence of Maragha Observatory that was built in Maragha in Persia in 1258, 1 year after the Mongolian invasion of Baghdad? And it was financed by the Mongolian ruler himself, Hulagu Khan. How could that happen if that civilization was totally devastated? So, moreover, how do we explain the great works of Nasruddin al-Tusi, Muhyiddin al-Maghribi, Qutbuddin al-Shirazi, Mu'ayyiddin al-Urdi, who are all worked at Maragha and produced the best of Islamic astronomy ever known? And the latter was adopted by the Western scholars during the European Renaissance as the foundation of modern astronomy, which we'll talk at the end of this lecture, inshallah. So the real reason of the decline you can find in the book of George Saliba, who is considered an authority of the Islamic heritage. It's called Islamic Science and the Making of the European Renaissance. And he gives a reason. He said the real reason that triggered the decline of Islamic civilization and sciences has less to do with sciences and more to do with the global shift of trade and commerce and the global distribution of wealth. Now, in 1492, when the Christians took over Spain, the last part of Spain. You know, after the Reconquista, the Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand celebrated the grand victory against Muslims in Granada. And that was a point that was marking the European end of Middle Age, and Europe is now consolidating its power and embarking into what they describe as discovery of other geography, of other areas of the world in search of riches and lands. So two discovery expeditions left Spain in 1492 for India that turned out to be very important to the Europeans' history, but also very important to our history. So Vasco da Gama sailed south along the West African coast and around the Cape of Good Hope, and Christopher Columbus sailed west across the Atlantic, you know, instead of going around the massive African continent. Now, Vasco da Gama was able to reach to India with the help of Omani sailors in East Africa, but Christopher Columbus could not find his way due to faulty view of the globe's map. Instead, he stumbled upon the Americas, which he came to refer as the New World. So Christopher Columbus did not discover the Americas as claimed in Western history literature, because millions of people had long settled in both North and South America. But his voyage did mark the beginning of centuries of European brutal colonization, destruction of the natives, their culture, and looting of their riches. This is a view of the European view of the globe's map in the 15th century, and you can see where is Spain, the continent of Africa, and India. What, you know, across Atlantic, they didn't know that there is a Pacific Ocean, and across Atlantic they thought this continent is India. And so Vasco da Gama went south, and Christopher went across, but he didn't arrive to India. And this is where he stumbled to, you know, the Americas, and he had to face another ocean, Pacific, before he can actually go to India on the other round of this globe. Now, writing to explain on the decline of Islamic civilization and sciences, the famous Orientalist Bernard Lewis, he wrote a bestseller which he titled "What Went Wrong with the Muslims?" when he should have asked what went right with the Europeans, because nothing went wrong with the Muslims, but what went right for Europeans. The 16th century colonization of the North and South America, the discovery of sea trade routes to India, and from India, they were able to go to the rest of Asia, to China, to other places. And the European transatlantic slave trade enabled the Europeans to shift their trade and commerce activities to North and South America, Asia, and Africa, and they bypassed the Middle East completely. By the mid-16th century, Muslim world, which was the center of global trade and commerce for a millennium, has now been completely bypassed. All trade and commerce activities are between Europe, North and South America, Africa, and Asia. And the trade and commerce is necessary to generate wealth that will support construction, sciences, innovation, and culture. So these massive riches from gold and silver coming from the American colonies and from the European transatlantic slave trade are now utilized as a capital to develop sciences, industries, and to rebuild Europe. Therefore, 16th century really marked the real turning point for both Europeans and for Muslims. As Europe progressively rose from 16th century, Muslim world gradually fell behind. So this is a picture of global trade routes prior to European period of discovery. So everything is concentrated in the Muslim world, all right? Because Europe didn't know how to go to India and China. It was the Muslims who connect the routes. Now, this is the roots after the period of discovery, and you can see that the Middle East is totally bypassed, and all major routes have been established now to connect the three continents. Now, so that's explain the decline of Islamic civilization and sciences in terms of when and why. So let's look at the rise of European Renaissance. We have seen from the work of Ibn al-Haytham that we covered in the previous parts that the Muslims established scientific framework, which was different from that of the classical Greek. It was based on three important building blocks: empirical sciences, all right, it's no longer enough just to think about the natural world, but to actually do experimental studies. So empirical science, and they developed a scientific methodology, how to do observation, to take measurements, to build theories and things like that, and mathematization of sciences. The mathematization of sciences is very important to be able to to build this scientific revolution. So the Christian West appropriated from Muslims not only the scientific knowledge, but more important, the philosophy of science. This is the most important part, because without the philosophy of science or the scientific framework, all right, scientific revolution and industrial revolution will not have been possible. So from 12th, 13th century translation movement of Toledo from Arabic to Latin, it will take another 500 years before the West had a good hang on Islamic sciences and the underlying philosophy. Yet, Europe's scientific output of the 16th and 17th century was still based on Islamic sciences, and I will give you some examples. So Europeans came to admire Muslim scientific legacy, but this admiration was overshadowed also by European envy of Muslim scientific and intellectual superiority. Also, European fear of what was long perceived as Muslim political and military supremacy, especially after taking over Constantinople, what is today Istanbul. And also there was a long church hostility towards Islam. So the political and religious enmity against Islam and Muslim intensified as Europe became more secular and more liberal, as we can see today. Now, Muslims had grasped the importance and careful use of the earth resources long before Europeans. And attention was paid to the earth and the environment as much as it was paid to the people who benefit from it. Therefore, Muslim scientists investigated, classified, documented rocks, soils, flora, fauna, domestic and wild animals of every region, and they compiled a lengthy inventory. Nothing that is zoological or botanical species escaped their notice or the analysis or classification. And Europeans heavily benefited from this huge corpus of knowledge of earth sciences when they woke up from their slumber. There was also a heightened interest of using scientific instruments for further discovery, as the Europeans realized that they can now begin to invest in the sciences if they have the right tools. So Europeans freely copied and traded many of the available instruments from the Islamic civilization, including instruments for navigation, such as astrolabes, sextants, quadrants, instruments for industrial application, such as pumps, crankshaft, gears, wheels, wind and steam turbines. All of these were important for the Industrial Revolution, and all of that came from the Muslim world. Okay, so these are all components of the industrial revolution that came from the Muslim world. The video was showing a Tusi couple, which is used in was used in astronomy, but also it has an industrial application where you could convert circular motion to linear motion, and this was the basis of many of the mechanical systems, including car engines that we can see today. So, if I summarize Muslims' scientific and intellectual contribution to the European rise, you have the scientific framework. Okay, this is very important because without this, there will have been no scientific revolution. There will have been no industrial revolution. And then you have the individual sciences. You know, they took from us the mathematics, astronomy, medicine, you name it, agriculture, many areas. And there were institutions as well, these universities that, you know, that could teach this knowledge, lot of innovation, lot of technologies, as you have seen, you know, these instruments that were, you know, taken, and also there was a knowledge base, you know, like the knowledge of sciences, for example, earth sciences as an example, but there are many other areas as well. So, you know, this is because many people, they kind of underestimate our contribution to the West. Now, I want to mention a couple of things related to as Europeans embark into, you know, this new era of scientific revolution and industrialization. The Greeks, they pursue knowledge just for the sake of it. They call it Aristotelian truth. You know, the modern Europeans, they pursue knowledge for making money and creating riches, creating wealth. The Muslims, they pursue knowledge for getting closer to their creator and for practical purposes of improving quality of life. Now, during Islamic civilization, sciences were financed through a system of patron, where rulers, wealthy people, and established religious endowment or waqf will give gifts to persons working on scientific projects. European monetization of sciences created a new ways of financing sciences, these venture capitalists. People who, it could be people, individual, commercial entities, government, or educational institutions, they will invest on sciences expecting return on investment. And therefore, investment in science has now necessitated a patent system or intellectual property rights to protect the investment. And that's why the first patent was produced in Venice, Italy in the year 1477. So this is something that we didn't have in the, you know, in the Islamic civilization during that time. So systems of patent, trademark, and intellectual property rights involve holding knowledge, not sharing knowledge, hiding, keeping it, you know. From Islamic perspective, holding knowledge or creating any form of monopoly, it creates a moral hazard. And this is the reason why we didn't have this in the Islamic civilization. Now, today, there's a lot of discussions on the legality of this from Sharia perspective, and there are some Muslim scholars who started searching, you know, the Sharia compliant solution where you can have a patent in the interest of promoting and protecting investment and encouraging creativity and innovation in science and technology. This is something that we need to think about. Okay, so that's cover the rise of the European Renaissance and how drew its power and its, you know, its fuel from the Muslim civilization and sciences. So now I want to, just to look to sample two scientific outputs that came from Europe in the 16th and 17th century, and I want to see how does it connect to Islamic sciences. Now, we have already established that the crucial point of the start of the Muslim decline and European rise is the 16th century due to the global shift of trade and commerce and the global redistribution of wealth. I'm not saying the Islamic sciences stop in the 16th century. I'm saying it's the beginning of the decline. It will take another 200 years until when we were totally disabled. All right. But this was the beginning. I'm talking about the beginning. There was still, if you read history, there was still very good contribution of Muslim sciences in the 16th century itself, the 15th, 17th century, and even 18th century. So in this part, we want to examine and demonstrate that European scientific output of the 16th and 17th century is either based on or highly influenced by Islamic sciences. Now, we know that 16th century is the century of Nicholas Copernicus from the European perspective, and 17th century, the century of Kepler and Tycho Brahe, Galileo, and Francis Bacon. And I think in the previous lesson, we touched a little bit about 17th century with respect to the work of Ibn al-Haytham in physics or in optics. So today I will focus on the work of Copernicus. Now, the first major scientific breakthrough in Europe is this work, the 16th century famous work on astronomy by a Polish astronomer, Nicholas Copernicus. And he wrote this famous work on the revolutions of the celestial spheres that is claimed by the Europeans to have triggered the European scientific revolution. This is what gave Europeans the confidence. Now, Europeans consider astronomy died with the Greeks and was brought back to life by Copernicus in his 16th century work, totally disregarding completely the Muslim contribution. Now, what you have here, you have two views of the solar system. The top one is the classical view of the solar system that was based on Ptolemy. And Ptolemy planetary theory, this is what the Muslim inherited. It's called the geocentric model because, without going into details, if you look at the picture, the Earth is at the center. And all the planets, including the sun and the moon, rotates around the Earth. This is what Muslims inherited from the Greeks, from Ptolemy. All right. And Copernicus is the one who said it is the Earth that is at the center, it is the sun that is at the center, not the Earth. So he kind of contradicted Ptolemy, and this is the model that is taught in schools today. And this model is called the heliocentric model. And therefore, the work of Copernicus is important in astronomy in the sense it's kind of indicate the end of classical astronomy and the beginning of modern astronomy. All right, but the question is, where did Nicholas Copernicus get his revolutionary ideas from? We need to look into that. Now, Muslims, they had always, when they studied Ptolemy, they had some issue, with the Ptolemaic geocentric model of the solar system. And it's starting from Ibn Haytham, he wrote a paper, or, all the way at the time, that he has some shukuk on what was presented. Now, the reason is, if you look at the Ptolemy's model on the movement of the planets around the Earth, he thought the planets move within a smaller circular orbit. At the same time, simultaneously, it moves into a bigger, larger orbit. He called the smaller orbit epicycle and the bigger orbit deferent. And everything revolved around this fixed central point, which is, according to him, it was the Earth. But Muslims found out right from the beginning, they saw there's a problem with this theory. You cannot get the planets to move uniformly at a constant distance from the Earth to make circular orbits, because the planets will wobble and potentially they will collide each other. And it was not therefore feasible to use Ptolemy theory to explain an ordered universe. So, if you look at all the planets, the picture at the bottom, it shows this chaos. And the Muslims, they doubted about this. They didn't believe that that was possible. And that's why Muslims from the beginning, they started looking for alternatives. So Muslim astronomer, though accepted Ptolemy's model of solar system, but came to object to the way these motions, especially epicyclic motions, violated the principle of uniformity of the universe. All right. Now, there were many, since then, Muslim astronomers started looking for solutions, all right, and there was a breakthrough with Al-Tusi in the 13th century. He came up with this Tusi couple, and this Tusi couple was later perfected by Ibn al-Shatir to explain as an alternative planetary theory.
These two circles are an example of a Tusi couple, a situation where one circle rotates inside another one with twice its radius. The Tusi couple is a special case of circles rolling inside other circles for this reason. If we mark a point on the edge of the smaller circle and follow it as the circle rolls, it traces a diameter line of the larger circle. If a circle rolls inside another circle, tracing a point attached to it will create a shape known as a hypotrochoid. A special case is formed when the point is positioned on the circumference of the smaller circle, which will then trace a hypocycloid. The second special circumstance is when the smaller circle's radius is exactly half of the larger circle, which is the condition for the Tusi couple. In this case, any point not placed on the circumference will trace an ellipse. The Tusi couple has a few interesting properties. When the tracing point is placed outside the rolling circle, it will create an ellipse, but as the distance is increased, the ellipse becomes larger and also more circular or less eccentric. The opposite effect is also true. As the point approaches the circumference, the ellipse becomes smaller. When the point is on the circumference, it forms the simple diameter line, but as it gets pulled inside the circle, more interesting things happen. First, another ellipse will appear, this time getting smaller and less eccentric as it approaches the center of the small circle. Finally, once the point reaches the center of the smaller circle, the ellipse becomes a circle with the same radius as the smaller circle, exactly half of the larger circle.
Okay, so this is a model, mathematical model, that is based really on very advanced mathematics. Al-Tusi was among the few scholars who developed trigonometry, especially for the application in astronomy. So this Tusi couple, actually behind it, there's a complex trigonometric identities or calculation. Europeans could not have done it at that time because they didn't have it. They didn't have the mathematics. So it has now been established that Copernicus' model of the solar system, he borrowed the mathematical model of Al-Tusi and Ibn Shatir to explain the movement of the planets and the moon, except Copernicus shifted the fixed central position from the Earth as it was perceived by Ptolemy to the Sun. And the picture that you see on the left at the bottom, this is the pages of the, of the book, the work of Copernicus, and you can see these diagrams of two-sea couples. He also borrowed from other Muslim astronomers. In fact, he borrowed from a dozen of other Muslim astronomers, including he took astronomical observation data to develop his model from the work of two famous Muslim astronomers from Syria and from Andalusia, Al-Battani from Syria and Zarqali from Andalusia. Al-Battani, he wrote tables, famous tables that were used for hundreds of years. They are called Sabian's tables. And Al-Zarqali, he wrote Toledan tables. If you Google, you can learn a lot about those.
That at that time,
astronomer Dr. Luisa Piggiotti and I are climbing up to the 18th century observatory.
because of the painting.
At the top, she promises to show me one of the most important books in scientific history. So, what do we have here?
Okay, this is the second edition of the Revolutionibus.
Copernicus.
Yes.
This is De Revolutionibus Orbium Celestium, which was published in 1543 by the Polish astronomer Nicholas Copernicus. I'll be careful.
Is it the second edition?
The significance of this book is enormous. In it, Copernicus argues for the first time since Greek antiquity that all the planets, including the Earth, go around the sun. For thousands of years, everyone had believed a very different view, that the Earth is static and everything, including the stars, sun, and planets, move around it.
And here there are all his system. Okay.
Oh, here we go.
And just look at the system.
The sun in the
it's
middle.
a famous drawing.
Yes.
One.
Oh, yes, and there's Terra.
With the
Yes,
moon.
here with the moon
With the
going
moon,
around it.
okay, yes.
This is an astonishing book, and many historians credit it with starting the European scientific
At the
revolution,
beginning, there are the principle.
the first crucial step in a journey that led to modern physics.
This is another eruption of the Earth.
Well, I agree,
Here,
but it does seem a bit odd that one doesn't hear much about where Copernicus got his ideas and information. The impression is that they came out of nowhere.
the beginning.
It's all in narrow. It certainly is a real revelation to me that he explicitly mentions a 9th century Muslim for providing him with a great deal of observational data, an astronomer who lived in Damascus called Al-Battani. Like all the great scientists of the Islamic Empire, Al-Battani lived in a culture without portraiture. All we have are later impressions of what he might have looked like.
And here he mentioned Hipparchus, Calippo, Ptolemy, and so on, and he started to mention what he called Macometus, Arapensis, and means Al-Battani.
Okay. And then the second book here.
And the second book is, we can look at the beginning in Latin.
I see, we can open it. Copernicus, in fact, made extensive use of Al-Battani's observations of the positions of planets, the sun, the moon, and stars. He worked with Latin translations, similar to this one, of the Syrian astronomers' data. Kitab al-Zij al-Slawi. So this is Battani's Zij, is his
Yes.
book of star charts. So it has the Arabic.
Yes, all the Arabic treatise, yes, and then the Latin version.
That's convenient.
But he certainly had the data, the observational data by Al-Battani. And you know,
And Copernicus's book is full of clues that hint at other past sources. And though Al-Battani is the only Islamic astronomer Copernicus actually names, recent detective work has uncovered clues that Copernicus based many of his ideas on the work of other Islamic scholars. The clearest example is Copernicus's use of a mathematical idea devised by the 13th century Islamic astronomer Al-Tusi, called the Tusi couple. Back in England, I compared a copy of Al-Tusi's Tadhkira fi Ilm al-Hay'a with another edition of Copernicus's Revolutionibus. In it, there's a diagram of the Tusi couple, and there's an almost identical diagram in Copernicus's book, even down to the letters that mark the points on the circles. So in Al-Tusi, there's the Arabic alif, which is A, there's the ba, which is B, Jim over here is the G, and the dal at the center, D. It's a remarkable similarity. Now, this might just be coincidence, but it's pretty compelling evidence. In fact, I truly believe that Copernicus must have been aware of Al-Tusi's work and other Islamic astronomers. Further detective work also shows that Copernicus used mathematical ideas for planetary motion that are remarkably similar to ones developed by another Islamic astronomer, a 14th century Syrian called Ibn Shatir. For some historians, this cannot be coincidence.
Okay, you have this video. If you want, you can watch it further. Because I'm running out of time, I will go beyond for about 5 minutes, Dr. Yusuf, if you don't mind. So this is the last example. By the way, Ibn Shatir was a timekeeper for the Umayyad mosque in Damascus before the invention of clocks. He calibrated the sundial with the correct timing for prayers, and he will check the time for prayers, and then he will give order to Muazzin to call people for prayers. Today we have so much of convenience, but this convenience was built on systematically on the work of the previous scholars. So Galen, a Greek physician and a scholar in the 2nd century Roman Empire, he made the first theory of blood circulation in the human body. And he theorized that blood from the liver is reaching to the right side of the heart and then went through invisible pores in the cardiac septum, which is the dividing wall between the two chambers of the heart, to the left side of the heart where it is mixed with air before it is distributed to the rest of the body. Now, Western medical historians credit William Harvey with the discovery of the correct circulation of blood from heart through lungs, which he formally published in German in this early 17th century. Now, William Harvey was from England, and he graduated from University of Padua, which was established, from the Muslim heritage, and he got his Doctor of Medicine from there. Now, interesting thing, in 1924, a very important manuscript was uncovered in German by an Egyptian physician, Dr. Muhyiddin al-Tatawi, which reveals a much earlier description of detailed pulmonary circulation. Now, the manuscript is actually a commentary on the section of anatomy in Ibn Sina's The Canon by Ibn al-Nafis. And Ibn al-Nafis, a 13th century Muslim scholar from Syria, who studied from and worked at the famous Al-Nuri hospital in Syria. In his commentary, Ibn Nafis, he explained the pulmonary system was based on the movement of the blood from one chamber of the heart to the lungs, and from the lungs back to a different chamber of the heart. And in his own words, this is, I'm quoting his own words, he says, the blood from the right chamber of the heart must arrive at the left chamber, but there is no direct pathway between them. The thick cardiac septum of the heart is not perforated and does not have visible pores or invisible pores as Galen thought. There was a Latin translation of the commentary of Ibn al-Nafis in 1547, which probably William Harvey had access, but still he didn't give credit to Ibn al-Nafis, and he was credited with the discovery of this blood circulation in 1628, while Ibn Nafis was a real pioneer of pulmonary circulation. Now, after extensive Muslim protests in 1957, 700 years after his death, Ibn Nafis was credited back with this discovery. So this is an example of 17th century scientific output, which was claimed to be European, but actually it was Islamic. So this is the last 2 minutes video.
Our understanding of the heart has continued to develop. Harefield Hospital in the UK is part of the country's largest centre for heart and lung disease. Their cutting-edge treatments build on the work of Professor Magdi Yaqub, one of the world's leading heart specialists, who set up the hospital's busy transplant unit and who's received a knighthood in Britain for his services to medicine.
The heart is such like a magic open. The more I learn about it, the more I respect it, because it goes on incessantly, beating quietly, maintaining life.
Professor Yaqub is also interested in the history of medicine. As part of a paper he commissioned for a medical journal, he's researched the life and work of Ibn al-Nafis.
Here we have a scholar born in Syria in the early part of the 13th century. He was a polymath because he was studying. He was a theologian, he was a scientist, if you like. He was a discoverer.
But arguably his most important contribution was his commentary on medicine, in which he looked at how blood moves through the heart.
So this is the heart, and you can see quite clearly the right ventricle and the left ventricle. And these are two completely separate chambers. The question has been, how does blood go from the right ventricle to the left ventricle?
For centuries, the accepted view had been that of the renowned Greek physician Galen. Galen said that blood passes directly between the right and left ventricles of the heart through tiny holes in the septum, the dividing wall that separates them. Ibn al-Nafis was the first to challenge Galen's view. He established that there weren't any holes, so there had to be another way for blood to pass from right to left.
The contention of some persons to say that this place is porous is based on the preconceived idea that the blood from the right ventricle had to pass through the porosity, and they are wrong. He's quoted as saying that for somebody as young as this person at the time, when he was 29, to have the courage to state such a thing is absolutely remarkable. Galen said that there are holes in the septum, but if you open the right ventricle like I'm doing now, it is solid. There are no channels whatsoever. Ibn Nafis was absolutely right.
Ibn Nafis stated that the blood must first pass through the lungs, where he said it mingled with air before it came back to the heart and was pumped around the body.
Now we know that the blood from the right ventricle goes into the pulmonary artery, which is here, goes around the lung, comes back in these pulmonary veins into the left ventricle. So this is the pulmonary circulation which comes here.
Okay, I think I'll stop here. Sorry for going a little bit beyond the time. Dr. Yusuf, are you there? Maybe you can...
Yes, I'm here. I couldn't move even because of your session, mashallah, very informative. Every minute was having heavyweight information in it. you took us through a lot of different aspects, mashallah, in politics, in science, in mathematics, in culture, in social. It's all rounded, mashallah. Jazakallah khair. No, very informative. I think we should allow a few minutes if there is anybody who have any quick question or anything to say. It's very interesting to look back at this historical points, and it really gives us a boost also in our civilization and the impact that it had over the world. Jazakallah khair for the efforts that you have put in and for presenting this topic to us. Anybody wants to say anything? Abdul Wahab, I see your video is on.
السلام عليكم.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Yeah, Zahab, والله جزاك الله خير. Very, very interesting, really. And it's quite inspiring to see. Actually, I don't have a question, just to thank you, and I hope it's recorded because, as you know, I have interest in this field, so I would like to go through it again. So, inshallah, Dr. Yusuf, once you record it, please send us the link. So that, inshallah, I listen, I will watch it again. That's all I have. Barakallah.
Inshallah. And the whole material, by the way, I have put the link in the chat so you can download the PowerPoint presentation with all the videos and everything. So that is available. So if you go to that link in the chat, you can just click on the link and it will download. But you need to make sure that you have enough space because it's close to 1 gig.
It's okay. I have space, inshallah. Jazakallah khair.
Barakallah. Anyone else? Any questions?
I think it's maybe overwhelming, so it's okay.
Yeah. But it's okay. Jazakallah khair, Sheikh Hafidh, and Jazakallah khair to all the participants for joining us. Inshallah, we are looking forward to the next session from now with Sheikh Hafidh. Jazakallah khair. Okay, so we'll bring this to an end. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.